Oh, I'm just going to get myself dressed.
Good evening. It is evening, isn't it?
It is, even though it's very sunny out there. It's blinding me a little bit, but yeah, it is evening apparently. So we're just going to wait for a few people to come on.
Although
Hopefully we're on
possibly
the right side.
most of you are watching the football, which I don't blame you, is probably far more
Well, there's one
interesting.
there.
So,
Possibly.
I guess first of all, apologies for last night's slight diary cock up on our behalf.
More ways than one.
Yeah.
Like
So we rushed off to a school play that we then discovered we were half an hour too late for anyway, so it was just, there we go. Anyway, we're here this evening and we won't keep you very long as ever, just a little live chat just to, yes, it is during the cup final. You're very welcome to go and be entertained with the football. Don't
Come
ignore us, come back to us later, yeah. What are we talking about tonight? So we're talking about question of the week. Now, some of you might have heard this title and thought, what does that mean? You may have thought it meant we're going to ask you, give you the opportunity to ask questions, but actually it's the other way around. Some of you have heard me talk about questions. Certainly in my workshop I spend a good chunk of time talking about questions and why we ask questions, as well as how we ask questions and when we ask questions and what we're asking questions about. So I look quite a lot at that in my workshop, but quite a lot of people kind of say to me, how do you get pupils talking that don't normally talk? And one of the things that we know, not just from driving instructors but from education in general, is that if you're asking a pupil a question, quite often the response that you get, which is I don't know or silence, is not necessarily because they don't know but because of fear. So it can be often a fear-based reply and very inbuilt from years and years of education and all that kind of stuff.
Even from parents saying, you know, poo-pooing questions and all that type of thing, isn't it? Or give an answer and then they, you know, slap them down, not literally, hopefully, and therefore they feel like it's best to say nothing or just say I don't know. It's the easy opt-out, isn't it? It's the cop-out, basically.
But also, I think that as driving instructors, if you look at the amount of questions that you ask and the kind of questions that you ask, I'm pretty sure that 99.9% of the questions that you ask, you know the answer to. And there's a fundamental underlying current then that runs through questions when you're constantly asking questions that you know the answer to, that you are testing a pupil on. That environment is quite a harsh environment, and although you might not necessarily think it is harsh, just saying things like what's the speed limit along here and all that kind of stuff, you're not asking those questions if you don't know. So what it does to the relationship in the car can be really subtle but very, very profound. So one of the things that one of my light bulb moments, I guess, was when I was looking at coaching and client-centered learning, was that for me, I had this realisation that for me a coaching question was one that I didn't know the answer to. So if I was asking a pupil a question and I didn't know the answer to it, and it was going to tell me more about that pupil and their thoughts than perhaps the answer would, the correct answer would, then that is a coaching question. So what's the speed limit along here and what's the stopping distance and all that kind of factual kind of stuff, that isn't coaching, that's Q&A. And yes, there are some very good reasons for Q&A, but they're not coaching questions. And quite often if you ask a coaching question or a question that is very individual to that person, very specific to them, and one that there isn't a correct answer to, that's when you'll get pupils responding. One of the things that I talk about in my workshop is the 15 reasons why we ask questions, and although I'm not going to go into those now, when I look at some of the questions that I ask, out of those 15 reasons, I'm just going to kind of handpick the few that I think that perhaps some of my questions of the week kind of answer. So the motives for why we're asking questions. So I'm going to give you kind of my top 10, I think it is, questions of the week that I ask. But when I ask these questions, yes, I might be inquiring about knowledge. I tend to be asking them because I'm causing someone else to feel special or important, and I think we forget that we can use questions to make that happen. I ask them so that I can gain some empathy through a better understanding of that individual. So, and that's really important to me. I ask questions to strengthen a relationship, and I think that is fundamental in the car is the relationship between you and your pupils. And of course I ask questions to gain somebody's attention. So the questions that I ask as a question of the week tend to kind of fit into these categories. Now, what do I mean by question of the week? What I mean is that, got it? Is that I have a question of the week in my car that I quite often have on a post-it note that I have stuck on the dashboard, and all my pupils know that there is a question of the week, so they know they're going to be asked that question. And actually I have to say that they that they get quite excited. They look forward to the question of the week, and they also look forward to hearing what everyone else's answers are. Do you need to be Heimlicked or something?
No, I'm fine. This to be on video, the evidence.
So they all kind of buy into this question of the week, and they're also really quite interested to hear what other people's answers are. So yes, I may well ask something that's a little bit random and a little bit silly. So if I think about maybe 2 or 3 pupils in the past that I've really struggled to kind of get talking, the questions that have really worked for them have been the slightly weirder ones, like, if you could have any superpower, what would it be? And why? Because that's the bit you're actually going to get them talking of. And you can see I don't know the answer to that question. I know what a superpower I might want to be, but I don't know what their superpower is. And it just gets them being able to think a little bit out of the box. It's not necessarily related to driving, although I think there's always a clever way of kind of bringing it back to their characteristics and all that kind of stuff, and being driver related. Question that I asked, I can think of one girl particularly probably a couple of years ago now who I did really struggle to get talking. And the question of the week happened to be if she was made Prime Minister for the day, and she could change just one law, what would it be? And she said almost immediately, she'd never answered questions immediately, she said immediately abolish university tuition fees. And then we started a conversation about that and about where she was at and how she was looking at different universities and what college course she was going to, and she was going to be a forensic scientist, and whoa, all of a sudden I knew exactly what was going on in her head. So it really helped me to get a better idea of her. But quite often I might ask a question that is driving related, slightly on a tangent, slightly out of the box, so that it allows me to kind of bring that into the lesson itself. So let me give you a list of some of the questions that I've asked recently, which have been really fascinating answers that I've got. And if you listen to these questions, you'll hear what I mean about me not knowing what the answer would be. And if you also listen to them, you'll hear that they're going to tell me more about that individual person than about a specific driving task, for example. But it allows me to obviously expand on that. So I have asked recently, what are you known for? So what are you known for? What do people know you for? That's a really interesting one. What do people know you for?
Me. Shirts.
Okay, so you can see that it's going to be really individual to that person. How would you rate your memory? That's quite a good one. And even you could scale that on a scale of 1 to 10. How would you rate your memory?
What was the question?
There you go. And you can see again how you can relate that back to learning and learning to drive. And the whole conversation can go in whichever path you then want it to go, but it's relevant to that individual pupil, and there's no right or wrong answer, and I don't know the answer to it, so it can't possibly be wrong, so you're unlikely to get a don't know or a silent response. Who or what inspires you? Quite like that one. And why, of course, because it was important to get those out. This was a really interesting one, and actually I do ask this every few months or so. I ask this one because, again, I think it's quite interesting, and you guys might have an answer to it as well, which might be quite unique. Is driving a right or a privilege? And I've had some fascinating responses to that, and some fascinating reasons why they think it is either a right or a privilege. And in fact, it's taken us down some interesting routes about having that privilege or that right taken away as well. So that was quite an interesting one as well. This is one that I really like, and even if it's not necessarily the question of the week, I use this quite a lot, but it has been my question of the week. if you could pass on 2 top tips to my next pupil, what would they be? So the next person that's going to get into my car, what 2 top tips are you going to leave for the next pupil? And you know, they really like that because there's that kind of sense of community again. And I quite often will link it to something very specific as well. So I might not leave it as random as that. I might say, what are your 2 top tips that you're going to leave? I've got to be careful how you say that. 2 top tips that you're going to leave for the next pupil about roundabouts or about rural roads or whatever. So we can link it to a subject as well. And that often tells me an awful lot about what that pupil's thinking, obviously, and about how they've learnt, and it also really allows me to reflect on my teaching because quite often I'll hear back what they have perhaps heard them from me over the last few weeks even, and what they're remembering. Just looking at Chris says, I like to ask if their parents have spoken to them about driving lessons, tests, etc. years ago. Normally get the answer they took 5 hours to pass first time. Yeah, I get that again, a classic answer, because again that's something you don't know, Chris. It's not something that you're necessarily aware of, and it gets you to understand perhaps some of the pressures that they're under, and what people have been saying to them. So again, to kind of link that with your question, one of the questions that I might ask Chris is something along the lines of their friends. So have they got friends who are learning to drive, and what are their friends saying is happening on their driving lessons, or how they're feeling about their driving lessons? Or have they got friends who've passed driving tests or even failed driving tests? How did they pass? Why did they tell you they passed? Or why did they tell you they failed? So again, looking at other people's kind of driving. If you want to keep it linked to driving, your question of the week can be linked to something like, who is the best driver that you know and why? And then, of course, that encourages you to then ask further questions about, well, what is best? What is good? Why are they best? Who do you feel most comfortable in a car with when they're driving? That can be a really one, because again, you can see how that question can go off into a really interesting tangent about safety, comfort, speed choices, what